Iran's Revolutionary Guards say they have struck military bases in Kuwait and Bahrain, and this is in response to the latest US strikes on Iran.
Iranian media citing the IRGC reported that during 2 waves of operations, 18 key US military targets were hit at Ali Al Salem and Ahmed Al Jaber air bases in Kuwait. The IRGC also claimed to have struck Sheikh Issa Air Base in Bahrain, following reports in Iranian media that the US 5th Fleet headquarters in the country had also come under attack.
Well, the US military has said that it has completed its latest wave of strikes against Iran. In a statement, the US Central Command said that its forces targeted Iranian military surveillance capabilities, communication systems, and air defense sites across Iran. Earlier, Iranian media reported explosions across the country's south near the Strait of Hormuz.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy announced that the waterway would remain closed until further notice, citing what it described as repeated ceasefire violations by American forces. According to Iranian media citing IRGC, 2 vessels attempting to transit Hormuz were hit, and this after warning that any ship passing through the strategic waterway could be targeted. CENTCOM said no US ships were struck, while adding that commercial ships have also continued to transit in and out of the waterway.
Well, the latest US attack came after President Donald Trump said that Iran would be hit hard as he accused Tehran of taking too long to make a deal to end the war.
They should sign their deal. It's a good deal. It doesn't give them the right to have a nuclear weapon. In fact, it totally prohibits them from ever having a nuclear weapon. And it was just tap, tap, tap. I don't know what they're doing.
Well, in response to Trump's comments, Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian said that Iran will stand firm against any pressure or threat.
All right, to discuss this further with us, we're now being joined by Bill Roggio. He's a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FTD's Long War Journal. He's joining us from Medford in the US. Mr. Roggio, thanks so much for making time for us. Let's start right off. This ceasefire, which even US President now says is the worst ceasefire ever had between any 2 countries or nations. US still carries out attacks and says now our attacks are completed. Is there still a sense that they want to retain whatever is left of that ceasefire and they're not keen on a full escalation? Over to you.
Yeah, this is one of the few things I would agree with the president on since this war began, at least in the messaging, that this has been the worst ceasefire I've ever witnessed. The ceasefire began in April 23rd. It was supposed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for the end of strikes on Iran. Neither of those things have happened. The U.S. has been striking Iran regularly because the Iranians continue to close the strait and continue to attack U.S. forces as well as neighboring countries. So this, as far as the strikes go, Trump's inclination since the ceasefire began in mid-April, towards the end of April, is to strike and then pause and then try and reinitiate negotiations with the Iranians, and that's been his modus operandi. But then there are reports that he's been very frustrated. You've seen this in his response in the press over the last several days. It's very clear he's unhappy with the Iranian response. So it's really difficult to know where this is. But the strikes are, even since the ceasefire began, or even over the last couple of days, have yet to reach the intensity of strikes that began when this operation began on February 28th and ended on April 23rd. Daily, both the U.S. and Israel were heavily targeting Iran's its industrial capability, military-industrial capability, and as well as leadership and other military targets. So we're not seeing that level of military operations from the U.S. so far.
Right, Mr. Roggio, and while the frustration and the kind of pressure that President Trump is under is quite apparent, what we also have is now, Iran, which is threatened to target all vessels transiting through the Strait of Hormuz. And now, have we reached that point in this conflict where we can actually start talking about Tehran being able to disrupt the waterway for a longer period of time? Has that emerged as a real possibility based on the trajectory of the conflict so far?
Yeah, we were already witnessing Iran shutting down the strait. Now, the Trump administration, President Trump himself said that We've recently escorted 22 ships through the strait in the dead of night. Why do they have to do that at the dead of night? Because they're worried about the daytime. 22 ships, that's impressive, but keep in mind the regular traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, I believe the number is somewhere around 140 ships were transiting the Strait of Hormuz daily. We're lucky to get, 4 to 5 ships out a day, and, celebrating 22 ships, that's not quite the win that President Trump thinks it is. The Iranians have successfully shut down the Strait of Hormuz. That's why oil prices are high. That's why the world economy is taking a hit. The Iranians, and keep in mind, they don't have to actually hit things. All they have to do is threaten to put mines in the water, occasionally strike the ship, and that's it. That's all, and that's what they've been doing.
Mr. Roggio, is the U.S. after Iranian oil? Because there was a startling claim by the U.S. president.
No, this is absurd. This is where President Trump just speaks too much at times. They are seizing the Iranian ships, and what they're doing with that oil is quite unclear. But the seizure of Iranian assets, this has been going on for some time. There's billions upon billions of dollars of Iranian assets. The same claims of seizing oil, we heard this during the Iraq oil war. The U.S. never seized a barrel of oil. And ironically, we heard this in Afghanistan as well, which it isn't even an oil-producing country. And yet that war somehow was about oil. That's a trope that is oft-repeated, but very often never realized.
Mr. Roggio, if I were to just counter that, they've often compared what they wanted to do in Iran with what they did in Venezuela. And after Nicolas Maduro was captured, they took control of Venezuelan oil. Largely, there are U.S. interests there. That comparison was drawn, but Iran is not Venezuela, which U.S. soon found out, and so did Israel. Given that, and the fact that U.S. president is saying we're taking millions of barrels of oil, even if you take that with a lot of salt, you still feel there is no interest in Iranian oil?
I mean, there's interest in getting that oil on the market and getting that out to reduce the prices. But the U.S. isn't going after Iran's capacity, oil. We're not looking to establish U.S. companies in Iran to create oil. The oil is being, the U.S. isn't taking the oil at no cost. The oil is being put back on the international market. So this is one of President Trump's many missteps. In speaking about this, he's not speaking about it in terms that are grounded in reality in this case.
Right, Mr. Roggio, and despite the fighting, we also understand that back-channel talks are continuing, reportedly with Qatar here. And now, is there any viable diplomatic, off-ramp in your assessment, or, any particular concessions which could actually bring the two sides back to the negotiating table at this point?
Yeah, I do think there is a path. Look, first of all, I don't think both sides, their demands are unrealistic to each side. The U.S. wants Iran to end its nuclear program, stop its production of missiles, and stop support for the Shia militias. But the Iranians aren't going to do this because this is the backbone of its exporting its Islamic revolution throughout the Middle East. To have the nuclear shield, to use the proxies, which are the vanguard for their Islamic revolution. The Iranians, to surrender that would be essentially surrendering its whole reason for existence, the Iranian regime, that being. Now, that said, this conflict there is a suboptimal solution. It would be a suboptimal solution for the U.S., but if President Trump wants the Strait of Hormuz reopened, and if he's pressured to do so by allies and by Middle Eastern countries, because I think they're tiring of having their countries come under attack, the Saudis, the UAE, the Qataris, they all want stability. And so an off-ramp here could be that the U.S. ends its blockade of the Iranian coast in exchange for a complete reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and no Iranian claims. Again, that would be suboptimal. That would still leave the nuclear and the proxy issue open, but you could get an end of the fighting that way and then deal with those issues later.
That would imply U.S. taking the first step back, and that essentially goes in Iran's favor, given their geographical advantage they have to the Strait of Hormuz, purely out of their location. Bill Roggio, thanks so much for joining us here on the show. I believe it's the first time you're interacting. Look forward to speaking with you again.
Yes, look forward. Thank you very much.